Awesome. Okay, good morning, everybody, or good evening in the case of people joining from other parts of the world that are not Eastern United States. I'm Allan Thomson. I'm the Chief Architect of Threat Defense at Avast Software. And it gives me great pleasure to moderate today's panel where we will be discussing 3 specific cybersecurity standards, specifically on how they can help organizations deal with cyber supply chain attacks. As most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar, defending an organization is a multifaceted aspect. And when you include your own organization as well as supply chain, really figuring out how to pragmatically apply standards to that and to assist you can be challenging. And we hope to share some of the insights on how you can use standards more effectively. So before we go through some of the content, I would like to first introduce the panel experts that will be helping us navigate this topic. Our first panelist is Jane Ginn. She's the co-founder of Cyber Threat Intelligence Network, and she's going to share her expertise on the analysis of some recent supply chain attacks, and then help highlight how STIX2 captured that analysis. And then ultimately, our goal is to share how that information can then be leveraged by organizations to share that more broadly, either within your own organization or potentially with other organizations that are trying to defend against similar attacks. So welcome, Jane. Another key part of cyber defense response is how organizations respond to threats, whether they're proactively trying to plan against it or they're reacting to an incident. And to help introduce that topic of cybersecurity orchestration, there's actually a new standard that OASIS have been developing to help assist organizations define orchestration and playbooks. Christian Hunt, Principal Security Engineer from Copado New Context, will be joining us, or has joined us. Welcome, Christian. And finally, and by no means least, Miko Rosa joins us from the National Security Agency, and he's here to share his expertise on OpenC2 standards, specifically around how that standard can help assist organizations in command and control activities. And welcome, Michael. So before we get into the rest of the content, we want to encourage people to pose questions. We will review those questions as you post them to the Zoom chat, and then we will get into the discussion after we've covered some of the slides, and that's the main point of the panel discussion. So let me put it in context of why did we choose these 3 standards. There's really 3 notional phases of a cybersecurity lifecycle. The first is really where you are collecting intelligence, data, telemetry, etc. You're refining it potentially from the raw data that you may see from security systems into a more actionable set of intelligence that can then be acted upon. And that typically activity can be multifaceted, but the intel teams then use that information and data to then communicate with other organizations within their teams or companies, or even externally. And STIX is that language that has newly been minted. It was recently published, actually, literally yesterday. The final standard was published by OASIS. And that's going to be a focus for a lot of the intelligence things that I mentioned Jane's going to be covering. The second phase is really how you start to orchestrate response and the set of systems and how you interact with either other teams to respond, so incident responders, security operations, and how you potentially navigate what systems do what when. And that's the second standard around CACAO, which is focused on defining playbooks and that orchestration aspect. And then the final aspect is really how do you then talk to systems that need to act on as part of that, say, playbook based on that intelligence? So how do you instruct a system to make a change, how you potentially update it to mitigate a threat, or even potentially just detect something new that you want to be aware of. So the life cycle, or those 3 notional phases, are really in a cycle, and that's how we're going to talk about it in this panel today. So let me kind of just summarize what we're going to cover in the topics today. Jane is going to talk us through the some of the recent supply chain attacks that helps us kind of contextualize how standards can help with that attack. And she's going to cover that in a moment. Then we're going to go into how STIX2 can model in those types of attacks, then go into orchestration, and then Michael will wrap up with the OpenC2. One additional aspect that we want to cover in today's discussion is really the challenges of taking standards and applying to a production environment. And that's a topic that is close to my heart, and I will cover some of that in the final part before we get into the panel discussion. So with that intro, I'd like to hand over to Jane, and Jane will talk us through the supply chain attacks.
Yeah, thanks, Allan, for that. Do you have my audio?
Yes.
Okay, so I expect that many of you are aware of or were impacted by the Colonial Pipeline hack that occurred in mid-May. We discovered shortly after the attack that it was an entity known as DarkSide, and the approach they used was ransomware as a service. So we're going to be using this as our use case today. And the first announcement came out from a press release on Saturday, May 8th, when Colonial Pipeline Company learned that it was a victim of the cyber attack. They proactively took certain systems down, which then shut down their entire pipeline. 2 days later, the FBI came out with an FBI flash, TLP green level, in association with DHS and the US Department of Energy, warning the defender community about this ransomware as a service organization called DarkSide. Next slide, please. Now, the analyst community has been well aware for a long time that there are very tight linkages between the cybercriminal affiliates, gangs, crime syndicates, and the Kremlin in Russia. And when the FBI pointed the finger to a Russian cybercriminal gang by naming them as a Russian cyber criminal syndicate, we also recognize that, yes, there is a detente between the Kremlin, the public sector in Russia, and the cybercriminal gangs. And we started to see the popular press coming out with that as well. At the same time, we had the popular press advertising to the world what we saw was happening. The analytical community started looking at some of the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that they were using. And we saw that when the FBI started tracking the DarkSide RAS cyber criminal syndicate, they had already grossed 90 million since October 2020. And Elliptic, the company I'm citing here, had identified 47 different Bitcoin wallets that DarkSide had transferred money into. So that indicated that they had identified at least 47 affiliates. And they also were able to identify some other factors that were interesting in that about 47% of the victims paid the ransom. But we learned later that the DarkSide Bitcoin was emptied, Bitcoin wallet was emptied on May 13th. Next slide, please. One other aspect of this was we saw that DarkSide netted about 15.5 million, while at least 47 affiliates, there are likely more, netted about 74.7 million during that time period that the data were published. Now, there were some interesting directives from DarkSide to their affiliates, and that is that they should avoid targeting companies in medical organizations, including funeral homes, educational organizations, NGOs, and government entities. And you could also see from this screenshot that there were certain languages in the CIS that were also directed to be avoided. Next slide, please. So when we talk about infrastructure attacks, typically in the software industry, we're primarily talking about infrastructure as it relates to the software itself and to all of the components that companies use to really implement their programs. In this case, we're looking at an infrastructure, a critical infrastructure attack. Next slide, please. And this slide shows you with the two boxes in the center of the supply chain here, the two highlighted in blue shows you where the Colonial Pipeline's role in the supply chain. So it was pipeline storage and the refined products pipeline. Now this was very interesting. Next slide, please, because you see we have about 5,500 miles of pipeline extending from Houston to Linden, New Jersey. Next slide, please. And that had a significant impact on the transportation of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel throughout the eastern seaboard from about May 8th through about May 17th. And then we also found out shortly thereafter that it looked like the hack was facilitated by a VPN compromise. Now, it caused widespread disruption. You saw hoarding. Here you see a photograph of a trunk filled with gasoline in plastic bags. But as I mentioned earlier, we saw that dark side servers were seized on May 13th. So this was really only 3 days after the FBI flash came out. And DarkSide went on their OSINT platform and informed their affiliates in the broader community that their wallets had been seized. Next slide, please. And so getting to this whole notion of how an analyst handles this kind of information and models it for sharing purposes. The primary purpose of STIX 2.1 is to create a mechanism whereby we can model the attacks and provide rich context around the data that we're seeing on the endpoints and in the networks. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Allan. Thank you. Now, when the FBI flash came out, we saw both domain names, IPv4 addresses, and URLs identified in the flash and sent as an attachment to the flash to the broader community. We also saw a blog article by FireEye and Mandiant a few days after that I drilled down into some of the affiliate groups, supposedly affiliate groups that had been implicated in the attack. Now, if you go back one, Allan, I want to make a point about STIX cyber observables. Now, you'll see these in the standard. This is the most granular data that you'll see. And this is really the old Cybox for those of you that were using the Cybox. Now, what we're doing in STIX, if you go to the next slide, is we're taking those very granular indicators and we're wrapping them in context. So we've developed a whole series of what we call STIX domain objects. And today, in the interest of time, we're going to need to just focus on a couple of these, just so you can see how you model it and how some of the companies that are in this space are beginning to represent these data. I'll look at indicator because indicator is really the key SDO within the STIX framework. And then I'll talk about a threat actor and then an intrusion set. So the reason indicator is so important is because a required property in indicator is the pattern. So you see I have highlighted here with the blue arrow the pattern and pattern type and valid from for the patterning language. Now this is written in Antler and it's embedded in JSON. And then you also see in this diagram that there is a diagram that shows the relationships between indicator and other SDOs. And you can also have relationships between SDOs and SCOs, the more granular data objects that we showed you earlier. Next slide, please. Now, what you see in this next slide is how we actually model the patterning language in the JSON. JSON is the mandatory to implement language of STIX, but there are many implementers, many companies that are also using other languages. Here in the JSON, you see I've highlighted the pattern and then how that's expressed in the patterning language. Next slide, please. Now, if we go on to the threat actor, you see here I have the property diagram and the relationship diagram here. And here you see that we have a number of different optional common properties and then threat actor specific properties that give the analyst an opportunity to really flush out what that threat actor is doing. Next slide, please. And here's a screenshot of an open source threat intelligence platform called OpenCTI that shows how they represent the information that's coming through, the machine readable threat intelligence that's coming through as STIX 2.1 over a TAXII 2.1 feed. And here's another screenshot of a representation in graph form that shows how the FBI data represented as a report, SDO, relates to the threat actor SDO data. Next slide, please. And then here's how it's represented in JSON. And you can see how we used one of those optional threat actor type properties to then define that this is a crime syndicate. So that's how we're relating this information to our sharing community. Now, we also added a really interesting SDO in STIX 2.1 called Intrusion Set that allows us to capture information over time. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll see that we have seen correlations between the malicious infrastructure of many previous cybercrime syndicates like Carburp, Carbonac, Fin7, Pinchy Spider. There's overlapping malicious infrastructure, including networks used, the malware that's used, and we're able to then deduce that there is likely to be some relationship in the human beings behind these various activities that were precursors to the dark side. And that's what the intrusion set SDO is all about. If you go to the next slide, I'll show how you can also, as an analyst, drill down into some of that malicious infrastructure and identify some of the TTPs that are being used by the various crime syndicates or cyber espionage teams or whatever you're looking into. And you can use the navigator in the MITRE attack to then compare and contrast the TTPs and make a judgment about whether or not there's some relationship in previously known threat actors. And here, I also wanted to point out that you can identify primary and secondary motivations of your threat actor group as you're working through your hypothesis about what is happening with this particular threat actor. So, and you'll see that I've used the term advanced persistent cybercrime in my naming convention for this intrusion set. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Allan.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. So I'll just repeat the instruction. If anybody has any questions about STIX2 or how it potentially could be used to model cyber attack, please feel free to post in the chat. But let's move on to orchestration, which is, once we have modeled intelligence and understood, or hopefully understood, some of the TTPs, the next thing that often organizations want to do is say, okay, how do I prepare to detect such an activity, or how do I respond to something if I am actually seeing an incident that is relevant to this attack? So Christian is going to cover this new standard called CACAO.
Hey, I'd like to start out by thanking Allan and Borderless and my fellow panelists for the opportunity to present here today. So let's get started. Next slide. So collaborative automated course of action operations for cybersecurity. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially allows us to represent process in a machine readable format. And we can do a lot of things with that. Automate orchestration, document process, and then we can also digitally sign them to maintain provenance and securely share these playbooks with other groups. Next slide. So, playbooks are basically all the steps involved in a process for accomplishing some task. And circling back to Jane's presentation, where IOCs, indicators of compromise, were received, playbooks can allow us to do things such as, receive these IOCs, push them out to our protection systems, then leverage that information to then reconfigure network devices to block traffic, this type of thing, create tickets, update a SIEM, follow the whole process there. From acquiring IOCs to actually doing something useful with them. They essentially allow us to codify best practices. There's a bunch of different playbook types, everything notification, detection, investigation, prevention, mitigation, remediation, and attack. Next slide. You can fully automate your playbooks. So basically, any aspect of a process that you need to implement to address some particular condition can be automated, including manual steps. For example, you may receive an IOC with a malware hash that you then go push out to your protection systems, but also search historic data to see if you've been exposed to that malware in the past. That can sort of cause a condition where you want to have an analyst go pull a hard drive for forensic analysis, and that manual step can be represented there as well. It also allows you to integrate for automation very easily with most environments, because you can execute commands over SSH via HTTP APIs, leveraging OpenC2 and several other targets as well. So, like I said before, malicious IP addresses, domains, URLs, patterns, network activity, things like this can all be represented by IOCs that we can then leverage in our environment to actually detect and protect against these conditions. And again, you can respond in many different ways. Some of the ways here are to isolate systems, block traffic, things of that nature. And like I mentioned before, forensic investigation of historic data. Workflows allow you to take individual playbooks that represent specific tasks and connect them together using flow control and logic. Things like, if you see this condition, perform this playbook action, or if you see this other condition, this other playbook action. You can fire off tasks in parallel as well. Like if you want to push, an IOC to multiple protection systems simultaneously, as opposed to serially. Next slide. Some of the key features of CACAO that make it very, very useful and easy to use are it's in JSON, which is easy to work with. It's also easy to incorporate into automation systems. We all know how to work with JSON. Digital signatures, because they allow us to protect the integrity and the provenance of a given playbook, so that when I create a playbook and share it with Allan, he can validate that it did in fact come from me and hasn't been changed. This helps facilitate sharing. It's easy to share these playbooks amongst internal organizations or amongst larger sharing groups and things of that nature. There's multiple ways to integrate with your existing infrastructure, like I mentioned before. Commands via SSH, HTTP APIs, leveraging the OpenC2 standard to interact with various devices on your network, and several other targets that you can leverage. So one of the great benefits is that it allows you to codify process in a machine readable way, which really does help to facilitate automation and integration into an environment. It's easy to customize. Not everyone can buy every single product under the sun. So it allows you to take your existing products and get them to work together in a more coherent manner, which helps increase your security posture, obviously, and can help improve efficiency and faster response times to incidents. And I think that's it.
It is, and I think you mentioned there how the playbook interweaves with OpenC2, which Michael's going to talk specifically some of the details about OpenC2. So Michael, please go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Allan, and the other panelists in Borderless Cyber for having me here. I want to also thank the OpenC2 TC, the current co-chairs, Joe Brulé and Duncan Sparrow, and everyone else, because this has been a community effort over the past several years to make OpenC2 what it is today. OpenC2 was, here to set a very niche area for handling command and control and trying to standardize that in a very normalized way. OpenC2 was looking at doing a modular approach. So we have created several specifications over the years, but we're really trying to focus on that ACT portion. As you see on the right-hand side of the slides, you see it, the OODA loop of sense, analyze, decide, and act. And OpenC2 is really trying to handle that remediation and response, be flexible and lightweight, and be agnostic in its software and platform and hardware as well. The three specifications being the language spec, discussing the semantics, talking about the schemas, and basically being a very lightweight specification for how OpenC2 can take actions and define those actions. We defined the first actuator profile for stateless packet filtering being one of those low-hanging fruits for showcasing how OpenC2 actuator profiles can actually handle these types of situations. And then if you can go to the next slide, please, Allan. We defined the first transfer specification for OpenC2 messages over HTTPS. And you'll see here we have an orchestrator and an actuator being shown on this diagram. The OpenC2 producer being the one that typically produces the command, and the actuator being the consumer, the one who receives the command and acts upon whatever that is. And in some cases, be able to respond back to the orchestrator depending on how that is. The good thing about OpenC2 is that since we took that modular approach, HTTPS is just one way we can transfer messages over, over the network. At the end of the day, HTTPS is not the sole way we can send OpenC2 messages. You also see here that we say we send a command using JSON. It's not the only way we can do that, although we showcase it here for the HTTPS messaging, sorry. If you can go to the next slide. So here I wanted to just showcase some of the current technical community development that's been going on here in OpenC2, because I think it really showcases not only how modular OpenC2 is, but where some of the efforts we're doing. Because at the end of the day, we're defining use cases and then trying to build actuator profiles to those common use cases that we see out there on the day-to-day. So some of these efforts that are ongoing are not the only ones here listed today, but there's more. So we have the endpoint detection and response, we have software bills and material, and then we have an update to the packet filtering specification that's already out there. I mentioned earlier that the transfer specification for HTTPS is only one version of doing that. We also have an MQTT specification for handling lightweight constrained devices and sending messages for OpenC2. And then we also have the information model known as JADEN, which is looking at a notation model, and that is actually going out for public review. And I believe it's a 20-day public review. So I do encourage people to go review that. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight also some of the current work that we've been doing in terms of Plugfest, because if there's one thing that we've been doing in OASIS as a technical community is participating in regular Plugfests. So about last fall, we actually had a Plugfest to discuss interoperability. And as we're looking at the supply chain and also just looking at defending IT systems, we have an opportunity to not only utilize OpenC2 commands to be able to have a normalized way to send actions throughout the network, we can also do that with other standards to make it more interoperable. So I'm not going to focus too much on the diagram itself, although it can be a lot to take in as well, but you see a data flow here for looking at what we might do when a new device is connecting. We can also use an OpenC2 command to obtain the SBOM information to understand what is on our network. We can look at how that endpoint sits on our network and the information that's on it. And then we can also send an OpenC2 command to take several actions, whether it's to quarantine or deny access to the network. So I wanted to highlight this as we look at the amount of devices that we see on the network and where and the different types of infrastructures that we're dealing with. We have the opportunity to use OpenC2 to send actions in different ways and commands that can help protect our infrastructure moving forward. With that being said, I will hand it back to you, Allan. I was trying to keep this as brief as possible.
Okay, no worries. Thank you, Michael. So one of the things that standards promise is it's going to make everything easier to make things work. Anybody who's been in this industry long enough could probably say that that's a little bit, sometimes rings true, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think one of the things that the reason why standards don't necessarily solve all problems is because multiple vendors are building different systems. There are typically reasonably complicated systems, and how you implement something in a standard specification doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work out of the box, or at least that's been the experience in the past anyway. And one of the critical things is that the reason why we want the standard in the first place is to actually connect things together, to be able to share information, either STIX2 or orchestrate or OpenC2. Ultimately, the goal for why we want to standardize is to actually build better cyber defense. And therefore, if it doesn't just work out the box, then we're really not achieving our objective as an industry. And so, I want to share an example of this, that of two organizations. So the organization was the company that bought two products, one from a threat intel platform and another endpoint protection agent. And both vendors, the TIP vendor as well as the endpoint vendor, said, "Hey, we support STIX." In this particular case, it was actually STIX1, but this example applies to any standard, frankly. They said that they supported STIX. They actually said that they supported specifically STIX indicators. And the company that was wanting to use these products plugged them together, and it didn't work. And why didn't it work? Well, the organization that was trying to do this or use these products, they didn't implement the products. They were told it works. They were told they were supported, and it didn't. And so what ended up happening was that a fairly lengthy debug process where escalation to both vendors, both support teams, and in the end, development teams ended up having to get involved to debug why their indicator being shared from a tip to an endpoint, that supposedly was all based on the standard, didn't out the box work. And the result was, lengthy, costly impact on the organization, both in the organization trying to use these products, but also the vendors themselves ended up having to get involved in a way that they probably didn't want to spend resources debugging a technical problem like that. And so who wins in that situation? The bad guys. So an organization, while this is going on, is not protected because these two systems are intended to increase or improve their security. And what was going on was really not an effective use of either those cyber defenses or the organization. And so we need to do better as an industry. And so OASIS recognizes this as a key challenge, that in producing standards, it's not just about the standard itself, it's also how that standard is implemented. And I think Michael mentioned it, and actually our other panelists mentioned it too, is that it's how you actually apply those standards to products in the real world and then make them interoperate in an effective manner. And OASIS is introducing a STIX preferred STIX and taxi preferred certification program, where vendors can submit a certification or for certification their products, so that they can be approved to say, hey, I support the STIX preferred program for threat intel platform. And what that means is that they don't just say, hey, I support STIX. It also means that they meet a certain criteria of quality and how that STIX implementation is done in their product. And so the intention is that these efforts to kind of start to standardize how products work together, not just implement the standard, but also how they interoperate, that everybody's boat raises up. And so we all become better at cyber defense collectively in the industry. And that allows us hopefully to focus on actually responding to the threat and understanding the threat, rather than dealing with interoperability problems, which oftentimes takes a lot of effort and a lot of focus away from what we really want to be doing as an industry, which is protecting the organization. So hopefully we've given you some insight to how STIX focused on intelligence can help communicate information about the supply chain attacks that we've seen recently. We've highlighted some of the aspects of how CACAO can start to orchestrate a cyber response, and then how that can potentially be integrated with OpenC2. And with that, we now would like to have the remaining time of this session to focus on panel discussion. And if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat. I actually have some prepared questions that I will pull up and start going through if we don't have any submitted questions. And so this particularly this first question or discussion topic is actually dear to my heart, and actually just related to the prior topic, which is that a lot of organizations are skeptical on the value of standards. Oftentimes they think it's basically more work than it's worth. Either as a vendor, I typically have worked as for most of my career as a vendor, trying to build products that are based on standards and ultimately can benefit organizations. But even within a vendor organization, it's sometimes a challenge. But certainly, organizations that are buying products, buying software to interoperate, they are skeptical about, what's the value or what's the worth of that. So I would like to kind of pose this question to the panelists, and maybe Jane, you could go share your perspective first, but then we can go through and ask Christian and Michael their perspective. But from your perspective, why do you think standards are not achieving the security that we need? And what would you suggest organizations do potentially do about some of that? So Jane, do you want to go?
Sure. So I think that most organizations are focused on their product and getting their product to market as quickly as possible, focused on the bottom line. And in a situation like what we were in when we were developing STIX, many of the vendors in this space had developed their own data model and wanted to push the product out there using that data model. And it requires a lot of focus and emphasis and staffing to not only participate in a standards organization, but then also to go back and reconfigure an existing product. And so the vendor community has been in flux as the standard has been developing. The critical infrastructure community, on the other hand, the buyers of the products, and it's not just TIP, it's all of the personas that Allan talked about when he was reviewing the interoperability approach that we're using in the Cyber Threat Intelligence Technical Committee. there was a lot of confusion in the marketplace, but now that confusion can be resolved because STIX has now been proposed as an OASIS standard, STIX and TAXI, and we're going to have a stable standard. And I think that we can move forward very, very productively now. Back over
Thank
to you,
you.
Allan.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Christian or Michael, do you have a perspective on this?
Pretty much what Jane said. You know, I mean, I would add in there that you know, historically, a lot of the heavy integration was sort of balked at because of difficulty and the time and resources it would take to do that, integrating disparate systems. You know, I think that now with standards like CACAO and STIX and OpenC2, it's less of an excuse because it's becoming, you know, easier as we sort of like attempt to level that playing field there.
Okay. Michael, do you have any final comments?
No, thanks, Allan. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's that idea that we have to have a security first mindset. And, you know, we're sitting here working on standards, and standards do take time. But if we can define some of these key elements where we can come together and just have a consensus that some of these interfaces would be better having a normalized solution so that we can have that plug and play mentality, I think it's at the end of the day, it's going to, you know, boost our ability to respond faster. And sometimes we need to look, you know, we need to start working now so we can get ahead of the game, but also having everyone come work with us, you know, can also help with that as well.
Agreed. So I'm going to turn to one of the questions that was posed by Michael Cutshaw. Hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. Michael's question was, tying back to the example of DarkSide, is there an ideal way that indicators could have been automatically ingested and used some form of automated response or detection? Especially since DarkSide had operations before the Colonial Pipeline attack, therefore indicators could have been indicated for various pieces of infrastructure and malware executables. So I think that's an excellent question. Jane, do you want to take a stab at that? You're on mute, Jane.
Allan, I'm sorry, I was responding to something in the chat, so I missed the question. Can you pose it again?
Yeah, so Michael basically is saying, DarkSide were active before Colonial, and as you've shown, you know, some of their TTPs were shared with other actor groups. Could there be a better way of capturing the indicators? And I think he's specifically referring to the pattern, you know, the stuff that you mentioned, where, you know, you could define patterns of activities to identify some of their activities potentially before such an incident like Colonial. So using intelligence to kind of get in front of the incident so that you avoid the actual eventual impact, for example, that Colonial had.
So that's really the purpose of developing cyber threat intelligence teams and maturing cyber threat intelligence teams, is to begin to take the operational data from inside organizations, use the data that's coming through the ISACs and the ISAOs, the sharing communities, use the data that's coming through our agency partners like the FBI through InfraGard, or like the sharing that's being done through the ISACs and ISAOs. Use that information with, you know, have an internal team that's mature enough to be able to use the information to get ahead of those things. And so it takes time, it takes training, it takes dedication, it takes focus on cyber threat intelligence. But I think one thing that has become clear to me in working as an analyst in this field is that we're never going to be able to turn over the actionable part of this to machines. There has to be a human machine interface. Humans need to be able to understand what is happening with CACAO, what is happening with C2, what is happening with STIX, to be able to guide and respond to the information that's going out, and then all of the actions that are taken internally to try to stop an event before it happens.
Yep, agreed. Christian or Michael, do you have any additional comments? I have a perspective, but give you.
Let's hear it.
So one additional thing that I would add to Jane's answer is that the pattern language is primarily a regular expression language where you can express either as specific a piece of indicator, or you can be more broad. And as Jane was kind of highlighting there, the definition of that regular expression is really based on an organization's desire to kind of cast a wider net or a thinner net. And so you can be this specific IP or this specific domain or this specific URL, or you can actually say a broader, hey, this CyberNet or this domain. So you potentially are broader, or even potentially multiple domains. So the interpretation or the use of the indicator can be up to how an analyst thinks about how broad they want to do it. The other thing I'll add is that STIX2 patterning can actually use other languages that are useful in typical security operations. So for example, if you wanted to, you could actually define a Yara pattern that actually would be useful for certain types of detections. So if you're looking for specific aspects of activities or indicators in a binary or a script, etc., it might be more natural to define that in Yara, which many companies use, and then you could include that as an indicator too. So then when that indicator gets published to, say, a threat detection system that is potentially looking at executables or scripts, it could automatically apply that Yara to see if there are any hits against that rule. And then you could then use that, the log output or the alert to then take further action, potentially, execute a playbook, say a CACAO, or go update a firewall rule for a specific aspect that was detected in the Yara hit. So there's all of these aspects that I think allow automation, but as Jane kind of, I think, quite suitably called out, the level of that automation and the specificity really comes down to an analyst and a team, a thought process that goes into how does my organization want to respond to that. Okay. So I think the next question I see in the list is, somebody called A. Marsland asking for similar examples of STIX intelligence. I think Jane, you'll be able to post it while I'm scrolling down the list, and so I see Jane has responded to the question. So let's go back to the list of questions that we have proposed. So let me choose one. What additional things do organizations need to do to maximize the use of standards-based intelligence? So there's a lot of activity in this field of organizations interested in either defining intelligence or using intelligence. But what can they do, and what are some of the success stories that maybe some of our panelists would be willing to share? So who wants to go first? Somebody unmute.
I don't mind going. Yeah, I don't mind going for first. I think even with the use case that we focused on today, with the fact that the FBI was able to quickly mobilize and empty the Bitcoin wallet of DarkSide within days of this event, was a signal that yes, the community is sharing the information about how the money is being transferred wallet to wallet, and who's behind, which affiliates are behind some of these attacks. And it was a law enforcement signal to the cyber criminal syndicates that we see you. And I think those kinds of events are very important for the threat actors, because they understand that, yes, this can't go on. We won't let this go on. The defenders are coming together.
Thank you, Jane. Christian or Michael, do you have a perspective?
No, not on this. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. All right. So let me go back to the questions in the chat. So Duncan Sparrow asks, STIX2 certification is used. Anything certified yet? How do you expect that to grow over what time frame? So the STIX2 preferred program was originally developed for STIX 2.0 specification, as well as TAXII 2.0. And the technical community has just recently published the final version of STIX 2.1 and TAXII 2.1. And so the technical community are actually updating that certification for some of the changes that have been introduced in 2.1. But the website is live, and I included the URL in actually this slide just to kind of refresh people. So if you go to this website, it'll actually show you, what is required to certify, and you can download the specifications of what was done for 2.0. Now, I must stress, to answer Duncan's question, there is a revision that's going to be published, this year, I believe, is the target for updating it to 2.1. And then what you will be able to do is download the test specification and then identify which persona or product capability you want to certify. You can actually certify multiple if your product is both a TIP as well as, say, an Intel Sync, for example. You can actually get certification for both. And so, the final part of Duncan's question is, has anybody certified? There has been interest, but the community has been waiting to get that final 2.1 version out before they really start to kind of open the floodgates of hopefully many vendors getting their products certified. There has been some tests where we actually went through with a couple of vendors to verify that the program would work, and that the whole process of submitting their test results to make sure that kind of the whole process of certification and validation of the certification worked. So we've done that, but the real launch for 2.1 is going to be later in the year. So if there are no other questions on the chat, I will go back to the list. So Jane, one of the things that you showed on the screen, which is a very common thing that's used pretty extensively throughout the industries, around how MITRE ATT&CK helps define the kind of the TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures of actors and their activities. And oftentimes, I think people focus on that framework, which is a good thing. But from your perspective, what are some of the key differences between, say, MITRE ATT&CK framework and STIX2, and help people understand the relationship between them? Just kind of one of the things that I will add is that MITRE ATT&CK framework is actually shared in STIX2 format. They've actually done a good job of defining that capability and be able to share it in STIX2, and they even have a TAXII server where they publish it over so that organizations can consume the content. But Jane, what's your perspective on some of the key differences?
So MITRE ATT&CK framework really focuses on TTPs, as you mentioned. And TTPs are critical to what we're looking at in the STIX SDOs, the STIX framework, but we're looking at a much broader picture. We're looking at the threat actors. We're looking at the world of vulnerabilities. We haven't been able to talk about that. We're looking at, we have the ability of analysts to register their level of confidence in the data that they're seeing and the sources that they're seeing. We're using the Admiralty code for confidence as a property on our SDOs. We have an opinion object. We have a report object. So we have a much broader context in STIX than just the TTPs, which are covered in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That being said, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is really key for the analysts in understanding the fingerprints that the threat actors are leaving, for drilling down into the motive of the threat actors. That then gives us a sense what the end game is for them. And that then also gives us a sense of the kinds of defensive postures that we need to take. Back over to you, Allan.
Okay. Christian or Michael, do you have anything to add to Jane's answer?
No, I think that was a pretty good answer. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think we have time for maybe one final question before the session is over. Let me look at the list. So STIX 1, the example I gave in interoperability, it has been out for a while. If somebody's already implemented, products or capabilities in STIX 1, what are some of the recommendations for moving to STIX 2, and how do they move their capability to the new standard? Anyone share their perspective?
I can let you all know that MITRE Corporation has recently updated their Elevator product that's available on GitHub. And that is a tool that will allow you to convert your STIX 1 to STIX 2.1. I want to point out something that we added in the STIX 2.1 version, and that is the extensions mechanism. And I'm sure Allan can give us a lot more detail about how important that is. But from the point of view of those of us in the analysis field, I often work with phenomenon in the disinformation and misinformation domain. And we don't really have SDOs that are covering those kinds of phenomenon yet. But we have the extensions mechanism in STIX 2.1. So we can build our own SDOs. Now, what we're hoping to do within the CTITC is to see how the market responds over time before we move forward with new SDOs for a new version. And I think that using that extensions mechanism, which is in section 7.3 of the specification, we can begin to ferret out some of the new phenomena. Back to you.
All right, thank you, Jane. I would just call upon Christian and Michael. Any final thoughts you would like to share with the audience as we're almost out of time? So please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment that, in regards to leveraging standards and using standards, some people balk at using these emerging standards, but the internet works because of standards. And if you look at systems now, we all know how to ingest syslog messages because it's a well-known standard. We don't have to quibble about the details of the format of the syslog message and that type of stuff, but it's there and we all know how to do it. Eventually we should be able to get to a point where we can actually exchange, indicators of compromise and threat intelligence in the same manner. It's just how it's done. There's no real questions about it. And I think that would get us a long way towards remediating and mitigating a lot of these issues. When this information can be easily shared. And as Jane pointed out, I think, one of the best ways to migrate from STIX 1 to STIX 2 is to leverage the STIX elevator. It'll still take a little bit of work to migrate, but the move to JSON, I think, was incredibly important and hugely beneficial.
Great. Michael, any final thoughts you want to leave?
Okay, thanks, Allan. I mean, just to tack on there, I think at the end of the day, between talking to these standards and seeing what everything else that's going on today in the standards world, we're seeing a lot of interoperability, and I think people need to see that we are defining key points within this automation cycle. We understand there's still going to be a human aspect to this along the way, and we're not going to be able to do all of it. But at the end of the day, if we can define some of this at machine speed and be able to respond at a faster manner, or at a faster speed, then we'll be able to handle some of these issues that we're dealing with on a regular basis.
Amen. I wholeheartedly agree with that. The faster we get, the faster we're able to both detect it as well as respond to the threat. So a good final thought. So thank you to our panelists, Jane, Christian, and Michael. Really appreciate your insights. And thank you to everyone who attended this session. And I will stop sharing and the session will over. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Allan.
Thank you.